Where do you feel that you're not competent to lead in a more natural way? And as a result of that, work on that skill in yourself. Many times we invest so much time and energy and effort trying to develop someone else instead of looking at ways we can improve ourselves as an effective manager.
Welcome to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I'm Calderon here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a father, a husband, a CEO of a growing global franchising company, also an author, and of course, a podcaster. That's why you're here. We've been covering a lot of things, Reed, over the last several podcasts. We talked about developing authentic and intentional leaders, sort of the overarching theme. Why develop leaders? Who you should develop? What capacities do leaders need? And currently, where in the organization can leaders actually grow? We talked last podcast about the associate level, entry level, basic, associate level. Now the first leadership level in the traditional structure is the manager. Today we're talking about the manager and the importance of that role. Why is a manager role important? What contributions can a manager give to an organization?
Yeah, I would say that as a manager, you're creating scale and consistency,
Okay.
right? And so ultimately, one person can only produce so much at one time. A manager would make sure that there's consistency of individuals that are there and scale. They're going through each their 5 to 7, 8 to 12. It depends on which level of the organization you're managing. People that report to you, and in that role, your job is to make sure there's consistency across the board. That no matter whom you're managing, they are able to produce at a consistent level, and then also that it can scale, right? Because as a manager, we should be addressing the things that are slowing down productivity and efficiency and recognizing, okay, I need to work and help with this new employee that needs additional training in their skills, et cetera. Or there's a customer with this employee that is struggling right now, so let me involve myself to some degree to help manage through that process so that they can get back to their, production role as well. So they're responsible for making sure there's consistency, addressing the team's needs, and then ultimately that there's in and every day as a manager, you're going to get a sense of what's going on, right? They may have some external things that are challenging their day-to-day productivity, and so you're going to help them there, right? Or they may have some new tasks they're assigned to, and so you need to train them and support them. And that's the role of the manager, to have some intuition around their team members and really where they can use assistance and development and encouragement.
Good. Now, success as a manager. What does that look like? I mean, there's so many, ideas and definitions on what a manager should be. What makes a manager successful?
I think as a simple baseline is who is staying with that manager and who is leaving that manager. So if you have high productivity employees that are staying with that manager, right, and the ineffective employees are leaving, that's an effective manager, right? Because if we just look at turnover exclusively, we can have the wrong people there that are staying forever and we have no turnover, or we can have the right people leaving and discredit that person with high turnover, right? So really what we want to have is there's really three levels of employee, right? The one that shouldn't be there, the one that we want there, and the one that's going to be there for a time and then move on to a greater role. And so we should evaluate a successful manager by looking at those three groups of people, saying, how long do they keep ineffective employees, right? If a successful manager is going to move on from those individuals quickly, right? They're going to say, you know what? You're not contributing to the value of the organization to the degree that I need you to. So I'm going to measure, your activity to invest in helping you perform at a higher level. And if you're not performing at a higher level, it's not going to work.
So a successful manager needs to hold people accountable and not be afraid of those hard conversations.
Right. I think I've said you cannot be a successful manager without firing someone. And people are like, well, why do you say that? Because now you've set a standard. We're all, as managers, going to make a mistake, or people's productivity changes throughout their career. Then the second group is the people that are your consistent performers, right? And we want to make sure that they always have the resources that they need to consistently perform and are not forgotten. And they're the ones that we want to recognize the most, right? So one time I heard a notable college coach speak, and his name was Urban Meyer, actually, because it's relevant for the story. And he had talked about how everybody focuses on Tim Tebow. And Tim Tebow was a multi-Heisman Trophy winner and national champion, and he got a lot of the acclaim. He said, however, Tim's not going to win the game by himself. And arguably, he's only playing 50% of the game. And granted, the ball always goes to him and he's got to make great decisions. But he's not necessarily scoring every touchdown. There's receivers that are receiving the ball and running backs that are doing that. And they need essentially blockers. Conversely, he said, the team also that gets a lot of attention is the people that are terrible, right? The ones that are either one, not a cultural fit to the organization, etc. And so he said, however, the winning and the losing is really that 90% in between. Your 5% of your top performers, the 5% of your bottom performers, but that 90% of the team that they block well, they receive the passes that are thrown to them, they run their routes well. That's where the games are won and lost. And I think that's the same for managers, right? We can just look at our top performer and lean on that one player every time, but at some point they can't run every play and they're not going to score every touchdown. Conversely is if we leave the guy that's always missing their blocks or the guy that's always dropping the pass, we're not going to win either. And it's really focusing on that middle group. And if we can make that middle group instead of 60% of the group to 90%, recognizing they're always going to have that 5% on either side, that's where games are won and lost. And so that's the role of a manager to say, hey, you have a critical role and you're blocking or passing or whatever the role you're in consistently. And I appreciate that. And I thank you for showing up. And we couldn't have won without you, as opposed to the person that's doing the touchdown dance in the end zone as the person we're giving a claim to, or focusing on the guy that just dropped the pass.
So the temptation for most managers is to spend most of their time on those bottom performers, right? The ones that are late to work all the time, the ones that do a substandard jobs, the ones that always seem to be the problem. How do you avoid that as a manager? How do you avoid turning around and ignoring your people who are contributing because you're spending all the time with this bottom quartile? How do you change that?
I think the first thing to do is to understand why we're tempted to do that. And one, I see this in managers all the time. They think it's a poor reflection on them. So they're trying to overcompensate for the poor performer or place blame on the poor performer. Ultimately, they are the ones that are allowing them to stay in their organization. And so they're trying to overcompensate. Two, they feel like that, hey, that person, that when they're here, they know what they're doing or whatever the case might be. So it's better than not having anyone, right? I just need someone in that role. And so I'll continue to accept that behavior. And neither of those circumstances are good, right? Because as a manager, we're not reflected on based upon the individual's performance. It's how we handle that circumstance, right? My dad, as I was growing up, he said a great contractor, he was in the home building business, would always, it wasn't a matter of if they build a great home or if they made a mistake, because everybody makes mistakes. It's how they correct their mistakes. And I think that's what makes a great manager, saying, hey, I made a mistake of a hire, or I gave you responsibility you couldn't handle well. And so my job is to not spend all your time there. My job is to change that so that it's not the case. That's the way we should look at a manager. What is taking me away from being effective? And, throughout our organizational history, we've definitely had employees and or franchisees that have disproportionately allocated our time to. They were not contributors to achieving our goal. And so as a manager, we need to look up and say, okay, what are the goals of the director, which we're going to get to in the next podcast, or the vice president of the C-level? And is this person helping me achieve that? And is the time I'm investing in this person building over time, right? Meaning that, am I going back to the same challenges I presented to them a couple of weeks ago and repeating those time and time again? They're not making progress, so I can't make progress. And so we really need to take a deep dive and look at, okay, how much time am I applying to this individual? And then if I spent that time recruiting and training someone new, would I be in a better position? And I think if you're an effective manager, you're going to find that if you did relieve that person, take on that role temporarily, identify the right person and invest in them, you're going to be way better off long-term than consistently investing that same time and time again, micromanaging or overmanaging or addressing problems that person continually presents.
Yeah. I have memories early on working for you here in our current company where we had a really, really great owner, and still do, in Florida, and his neighbor was a horrible partner, was just always underperforming, causing problems. And I remember the owner, who's still with us, he told me one time, what are you guys going to do about this guy? Well, how come no one's doing anything? Now, he didn't understand what was going on in the background because it wasn't really his business. But what he did see was, I need to stick with it. I need to focus on my job. And he did. and he grew, and that other owner eventually left and is no longer part of the organization. But that owner got even more successful and is doing really well in Florida because I think in that role as a leader, you and other people in the office here were able to give him what he needed to be successful. Now, what do you say to those managers who want to come in heavy-handed, who think I need to be commanding, I'm in charge, I need to be never show any vulnerability and kick open doors and everything, and they think that's the way you get people to perform? What do you say to those kind of managers?
Well, first of all, I think one, that is generally a byproduct of insecurity.
Right.
When you are taking a high level of control over anything, that's because you're insecure. You feel like and if you are a control-minded person, and this is something that's hard to comprehend and understand, it is largely masking or controlling around your insecurity. So look inside. If you're a leader that feels like you have to command and control, what insecurity are you masking? Where do you feel that you're not competent to lead in a more natural way? And as a result of that, work on that skill in yourself. Many times we invest so much time and energy and effort trying to develop someone else instead of looking at ways we can improve ourselves as an effective manager. And, as a leader, people will respond to your leadership style or ability. And then quite frankly, conversely, the subordinates, in this case, associates, are watching what you're doing as a leader. And they're going to say, if you're going to accept that behavior, what other behaviors will you accept? And I won't work here, right? They say that people don't leave organizations, they leave leaders or managers.
Right.
And so then what management technique are you deploying that would otherwise drive people away? And that might be making slow decisions or being ineffective. And so I think ultimately, one of my really heroes in management and leadership is Tom Osborne. And I watched, particularly through the 90s, I'm a huge Husker fan, where he was, the coach that was really leading the organization. And what he did is he understood he would go all the way to encourage a player in a position that may not even be the starter, could be a walk-on or otherwise. And he really encouraged and got to know them and otherwise. And what he understood is not what they would do for him, but what they were trying to accomplish for themselves. And so if some of them wanted to become a professional football player, perfect. I can help you do that. Some of them said, hey, I'm here, I'm on scholarship, I want to be on a winning team. I realize the professional NFL is not for me, but I want to go and move on. And as I've watched their careers later, many of these players became doctors. There's some in Omaha that are doctors or, influential business owners in Omaha, among other things.
What they learned transferred to the rest of their life, not beyond football.
Absolutely. And I think that's what an effective manager does, is saying, hey, you're here. And while I have you, what skills can I help you throughout your career? And it may not be at Signal, right? In our case, that's what I always tell people is I want you to come here, be enriched while you're here, and then, go enrich when you leave here, right? Meaning that you go and invest that into others in your other stage of your career. And so when someone comes to me and said, hey, I got to move on to another organization, I'm encouraging them because they've made that choice for themselves. That's great. That's what we want in our lives and careers. We want to direct and have the ability to have opportunities in our career, and they may not always be at the current organization or current role that we're at. And so I think that's part of that as a manager is we want to make sure that we are leading them towards their goal and aspiration, not just achieving our goal. And so how do we do that? We ask questions and listen. That is the most critical tool. If you're saying, what do I need to do as a manager? Number one, ask questions. Number two, listen. I think the most effective leaders and managers are those who have the best questions and listen the most deeply and broadly. You're listening to not only the words they're saying, but how they're saying it, when they're saying it, and why they're saying it, right? And that ultimately will give you intuition to help manage them more effectively as they continue to develop and grow in their careers.
We teach that in our sales process too, don't we? About listening, asking questions, letting the prospect talk, and then coming with a solution.
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
And I think that's a lost art in America, right?
Agreed.
We are just throwing data and information. We're inundated with it. If you look at your content that you're getting from social media, none of it is a question other than the answer they're going to provide right afterwards for you. It's just a singular point of contact. And so we have forgotten the art of questions. Yet, in a recent book that I read, it said a more beautiful question, meaning that the answers are all there. Google has them all for us, but we don't know what to ask Google or AI or anything that's going to provide this information. And we lose creativity around questions, right? We just don't think about that. And that's ultimately how we learn is we articulate a question that we can gather new information on to become better at.
Well, I have a question for you, Reed. Should all associates, everybody aspire to move into lead? Should everybody be a manager? Should everybody say, "Oh, someday, I'm at this level now, but everybody want to be a manager"? Is that reasonable?
Absolutely not.
Good.
right? I think there's a couple of reasons why. One, first, sometimes people want to be a manager because they want the title and the pay. And I see those are the biggest mistakes. Like, well, I need to afford a new house or a new car, and the only way I can do that is to get into management. I can tell you that individual contributors can sometimes get compensated dramatically more than a manager or a leader. So that's just a big misnomer. At the same time, is they're not skilled at effective management techniques, right? That's a capability that not everybody has.
That's a different
Right.
skill set than being able to be good at your job,
Yep.
right? Being able to manage people to be good at your job is a different skill set.
I'll give a couple of extreme examples. I mean, Michael Jordan was arguably one of the best basketball players ever to live, right? He then became a team owner, and he had the number 1 draft pick and picked up the draft pick. And then he's like, I'm going to manage this guy to be a high performer. He had all the athletic ability, but what he was totally ineffective at is developing a way to bring the best out of that. And it was one of the largest draft busts, in history of the NBA, was his number 1 draft pick. And Kwame Brown was the guy's name. You can look it up. But ultimately, this guy, he would just go grade him and berate him and drive all the way down in that. And he was a completely ineffective manager. Michael Jordan's success and legacy is built upon his ability as an individual contributor. And then when he went into management, he was not effective. But one would argue that he knew every aspect of basketball because he could deploy it. That's an extreme example of how an individual contributor doesn't need to be a manager.
Now, have you seen that where you saw someone who you thought who did great at their job? You moved them into leadership, and then you realized, they don't have the skill set to actually be a leader of people.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes that is a trap of a higher level leader, director, vice president, and C-level, because we're like, I can't get to all these people, right? They say in management, there's either, if you're managing kind of direct supervision, 5 to 7 or 8 to 12. Somewhere in between 5 and 12 is an effective number. So as you're approaching, say, 14, 18 direct reports, you're like, I need to hire a manager, right? I need anyone. And this is my best individual contributor that I'd have to spend the least amount of time with. I'm going to promote them to a manager. And that's a huge mistake because ultimately what happens is then you lose the other 4 to 7 that they're managing, right? Because they're, as I just said, people leave managers, not organizations. And so, that's a struggle. And so one thing I've learned is don't bring in someone because you need a manager. Bring in someone because they are a manager. And so it's making a decision out of desperation instead of, development. And so I will manage more people when I don't have a manager instead of bringing in someone that is not a manager to manage people, because your tasks are not getting done. And it's even more frustrating, right? It's more frustrating because you're like, how come they were productive before, then I bring in this manager and less productive? And you have to make that decision there. And so then you can't make all the changes at once. I think that's the other thing to do as a manager. What we need to do as a manager is saying, okay, here's sequentially, and I always start at the beginning, right? And work your way there. Same thing on a task. You can't solve all of them at once. You start at the beginning and walk them all the way through, and that's the next generation. And if you see a new coach or a new leader, they're going to say, hey, I got to get this recruiting class to continue to adopt my behaviors because they'll be here for 3 to 5 years versus the seniors that are going to only have, 10 to 15 games left or whatever the number might be. And they're not going to adopt those behaviors at a later stage. So as a manager, start with your new employees. Right? Make sure that if you're taking on a role, make sure they align. They don't have necessarily leadership history with the previous people. They don't have experiential history. So they are more likely to adopt your new behaviors, and that becomes your new culture. And over time, what you'll see is that will become your new culture as a manager and leader. And then the others that don't quickly or readily adopt those things will move on.
Yeah, good. All right. So brand new manager, right? New in an organization, presumably maybe young, maybe not. Can be a little intimidating, right? If you've always been only in charge of yourself and the way other people act in your organization, you don't take responsibility for that. Now you're a brand new manager. You're in this role. What advice would you have for someone who's in that role? Brand new, first time.
Yeah, I would say get to know the people that are there. I wouldn't even worry about the tasks they're doing. I think we're managing people, not processes, right? Especially as a manager. And so I have 3 questions that I always ask people, and it's very good to just get a sense of who they are. Who are you? Just how would they characterize themselves, right? And it's just an open-ended question that whatever they illuminate, you can ask follow-up questions too to get more clarity on. Second, why are you in this particular role or job, right? Why did you come here? What brought you to here? Why, what is the motivation that's going to keep you here? And largely what they answered there will be the ones that you can use, as tools to help them get refocused, right? Meaning if they're, I'm here for my family or to provide for my family. Okay, well, I need you to do this so you can provide for your family, right? And then the third is really, where do you want to go from here? right? And that's our developmental tool as a manager, saying, how can I help you? How can I come alongside you and help you aspire to your next step, right? What's the progression afterwards? And so if you ask those questions at the very beginning as a new manager, you're going to be surprised at the camaraderie you're going to build, the loyalty you're going to gain, the relationship you're going to establish, and ultimately how over time you can go back to that initial conversation throughout duration of conversation to go forward. And one thing that I always ask as I start managing someone else new, and so that's the other side of this, when you get a new employee to your team, is saying, how are you most effectively managed? I said, where have you been most effectively managed? And I, as a leader and manager, adjust my leadership management style to the way that they answer that question. Some say, well, I just need direct feedback immediately. I said, no problem. Some say, hey, ultimately, when I have a rough day, just give me time to kind of process things, right? So that I can think through it all and then I'll be organized when I come back to you. Okay, understood, instead of piling on at the time. Or if you notice behavior that I'm changing, give me the feedback immediately so I can change it. Or why don't we just sit down and evaluate the totality of my experience so that we can discuss it in totality, because I'm more a procedural thinker. So those are the things that you want to listen to and adjust, right? So ask questions and adjust, listen to how they are leading, or they are best led, and then ultimately lean into that as time allows.
Managers, a key part of any organization. Thank you, Reed, very much for sharing with us today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to ReedFlections. Next time, we're going to talk about directors, continuing that step up that ladder, directors, and we're going to see the contribution and the value of a good director in a traditional role. In the meantime, I'm Art Calderon. Stay purposeful.
If you are a manager and this is your first time managing, ask questions and listen. And then recognize that many times as a manager, your focus is on the associate. Instead, your focus should be, how can I be a better manager? Instead of trying to improve their performance, look at how you can improve your performance. And what you'll find is they will follow your lead. If you are introspective and looking at how can I improve, they will then look at their own role and say, how can I also improve? I believe you can be an effective manager. And as a manager, now you're creating scale and you can change lives. Lean into that this week. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we study directors.